Hey guys, and welcome to another educational video. As you can see, today I'm going to talk about radoms. Again, this is just going to be a broad brush overview. I already did a video, if you want to check it out. It's actually about slave labor, but I talk about the BNZ variation, which is a radom made in the Steyr Factory. We'll save that for the end. But let's first go back a little bit and start at the beginning of the development of the Polish Radom pistol. So first and foremost, I don't want to insult the Polish people because I certainly am no expert on Polish history, but I do find the history of Poland to be fascinating, and I would love to get comments from some of you who know more than I do. But a real quick read about the development of the Radom, which is a phenomenal pistol, by the way. It's still very popular. Poland, and they're situated between Russia to the east and Germany to the west. So they're kind of between these two fairly aggressive countries back in those days. And in fact, there was I'm not going to call it a war, but there was a skirmish with Russia, and there was a lot of tension on the eastern side with Russia in the 1920s. And that really is part of what led to this development, because during that time, Poland was relying on German weapons and Czech weapons and a couple other countries. What they found was when they were having war or skirmishes with Russia, the other countries didn't want to get involved, and so a lot of times they couldn't count on shipments of weapons. So they very early realized, hey, we got to make our own. So in 1930, they started developing their own plan, and they're very, much more nationalistic, meaning we need to not depend on other countries, we need to build our own. And so they looked to the 1911 Colt, which was a very successful design, and they also looked at the Browning High Power, took some of the elements of both, and developed the Polish Radom. So before 1936, there was a couple prototypes, but the first one to be made in mass production for the military was the 1936. I have a sample here. These are very rare. In fact, 37, which you see here, the next one is 1937. 1937 is the lowest production number, the rarest to find. I'm a proud owner of that one. It took a long time. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of an idiot scratch right there. Can't do much about that. But a 36, a 37, and they made them all the way to 39. And by the way, the name of this pistol is the Polish Radom Eagle, and that's because you see the Polish Eagle right here, and that would be their logo. And a couple other identifiers. You see it has 3 levers. This is similar to the 1911 and the Browning. This is a grip safety, which we talked about that when we talked about the Lugers. This is an additional safety feature, and this is a decocker. So this is called a 3-lever Polish Radom Eagle, and these were slotted. I don't have a stock, but they did make stocks for them. Hardly ever used. You will almost never find a Polish stock. But a couple other things to identify. Not only do we have the date, but the name of the factory is FB Radom. And here's what FB stands for. You can see it written out. Fabbrica Bruni. That sounds Italian to me, but Fabbrica Bruni, I might be saying that wrong, but there it is. You can see on the, this is a Bakelite grip, kind of like the Black Widow grip on the Luger, but much earlier, certainly in 36, they had the name of the factory, FB. Radom was the town, by the way. Just outside of Warsaw, the town of Radom is where they made these. And by the way, Fabbrica Bruni just means State Weapons Factory. And on the other side, we see VIS. So I've often heard these referred to as a VIS, a Radom. VIS actually is, I had to look this up, never knew this, it's Latin for strength. So VIS and the factory, and it's a Polish Eagle Radom. You can see the finishes, it's kind of a dust blue. They used a rust blue, but this is kind of a dustier blue. When we get to the Nazi era, we'll see that they actually made them a little shinier. And now before I move on to some of the accessories, these come in 9mm Luger, which they were buying Lugers from Germany, so they like the 9mm Luger, and that's why they developed this in 9mm Luger. You can see the other side, the ejection port, and the serial numbers. And speaking of serial numbers, take a look at this graphic. You can see The serial numbers for 36, 37, you can also see the lowest production number was 3,500 in 1937. Oh, the reason for that was they decided to focus on rifles that year. They were short on rifles. So even though they could have made more, they put an emphasis on making rifles in 37. But then 38, 39, production picked up. And then, of course, we know that in September of 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. And by the way, the same time, Russia came in from the east. So they were attacked from both the west and the east. And both armies pretty much brutalized their army and their people. So one of the most unique holsters out there is the Polish Radom Eagle holster. That's a mouthful. Polish Radom Eagle holster. Very unique. Here's a couple things unique about it. This one goes with the 1937. This came together as a rig. You can see it's dated 1937. It's very cool that it still has the ink stamp inside. They did come with a cleaning rod. And this one will be stamped G2. You can see a G2 proof. Here's a close-up of a G2 proof. Also, there's a spot for 2 additional magazines. You can see the magazines. It's just an inspector proof. There's a G2 proof on the bottom of both of these magazines. That together with the one that's in the gun, you have a rig with 3 magazines full of ammo. So this is what the holster looks like. And by the way, these holsters can be $2,500, $3,500 just for the holsters. Very popular, and again, I said very popular with collectors, but Polish Americans often are the first ones to grab these when they come up on the website. And why? Because they're very proud of their heritage, and they should be. This one also came with a couple of medals. I will say right off the bat, I don't know that these are real or not real, but it came with this, along with this book. This book is dated 1938. And it's some kind of a government issue book. Oh, it was owned by Miller. Doesn't sound Polish. But anyway, this came with the 37 along with these two. This is dated 1944, and I know this is a resistance medal that the Polish government gave out. And this medal from 1920, I can only guess that it was part of the skirmish with Russia in 1920. So these 2 medals came in this beautiful case. And keep these all together with the 1937. That's how it came to me. Okay, so in 1939, September of 1939, we already know that that's when the war officially began, because that's when the actual hostilities, of course there was hostilities before, but this was the official start of the war, September of 1939. The Nazis came in and took over the factory. They took over the country very quickly. The Polish army was no match for the German mechanized divisions that came through, and that's where the name Blitzkrieg came from. They came in with their Stuka bombers, bombed, and then rolled in with their tanks and the military vehicles, rounded up a good number of the population and imprisoned them. A lot of people ended up dead. The Russians blamed the Nazis blamed the Russians, but most of the Polish officers were executed and found in mass graves. Along with that, of course, we know that they took reprisals against whole villages. It was a pretty brutal way to start off World War II, and only a harbinger of many, many worse things to come. But let's get back to the Radom, because when the Nazis came in, of course they took over, but it took them until about 1940 before they started producing their own Nazi Radom pistol. So no longer do you have the Eagle. Of course, they're not going to put an Eagle on it because they're getting rid of the Polish government and taking over. And instead, they put their own Waffen stamp, which is a Waffen 77. They're still slotted, even though they didn't make the stock, because this is the Polish Radom. They're still slotted. They didn't make the stocks, but I guess it was already machined to put the slot in. It still has all 3 levers. It still uses the same grip. This one is in the B block. So let's talk about the lettering system. So the Germans, just like they did with the P.38, they like to use a letter prefix. And in the P.38, they would use a letter prefix by month. My understanding, doing the math on these, during the Nazi era, there was 300,000 made. and they went from no prefix to A to Z. So basically A to Z, but then there was also a group of no prefix. Unlike the P.38, I don't think the letters correspond to months. They basically just made 10,000, and when that was done, they went to the next letter. So they made 10,000 no prefix, 10,000 A, 10,000 B. It was actually 9999. With the letter prefixes and knowing that they did about 10,000 of every number, there's 26 letters to the alphabet, but there's actually, for some reason, there's 6 letters they didn't use. I can only guess that it was to avoid confusion. So, for example, they didn't, they haven't found them in the O or Q. Maybe an O or Q prefix would make it look like a zero prefix and would confuse people. So they didn't do O or Q. There's actually 6 letters they didn't use. So that makes 20 letters of the alphabet, 10,000. That's where I come up with 200,000 from A to Z. A to Z, the first, the early ones in no prefix, all the way to D, they were slotted, and they used this high polish rust blue. Now let's compare it to the Polish Radom. I don't know if you can see a difference. This is a little duller than the German. The German rust blue this is basically the same rust blue they used in the German factories. So I think they used a different formula. This is kind of a dusty blue, I call it. I don't know if that's the official term, but this is a dustier blue. This is a rust blue, very nice. They also stamped it with a Waffen 77, which was the inspection stamp for the Radom factory. Now there's a lot to tell about this because as the production continued, what we find is the bluing went from a rust blue to a salt blue, which is more of a military blue that we're used to. Again, same thing happened in Germany. They went from a rust blue to a salt blue, and so you see what I call the military finish is deteriorating and a lot cheaper. I failed to mention the reason they went to salt blue was because it's a lot cheaper, a lot quicker, and the goal was to get these things out as quickly as possible. So they go through the alphabet, and starting with no prefix, there's a group of Navy-issued Radoms in the no prefix and A prefix. So only in the early ones. Again, these would be 3-lever, slotted, and they will have a Navy Kriegsmarine Eagle on them. Here's a picture of one. You can see it on the frame. On the left-hand side, these are heavily faked, so you have to be careful. If you know that stick wing eagle, it's the exact same eagle as you will see. They use the same stick wing eagle. I believe they did these at the Navy arsenal. So when the Radoms got there, they used the same stick wing eagle on it. And they also use the N property mark on the front strap. Sometimes it's just an N, and sometimes it's an N with a property mark. But again, I've owned 2 Radoms that had the stick wing eagle, and after owning them for a while, I just was not sure that they were real. So the ejection port, it's unfinished. Unfinished. So all these early guns all had an unfinished barrel, but for some reason, the Kriegsmarines had no lanyard and a blued barrel. So again, I have no idea why. So there are a group in the early, this is, you can see this is no prefix. So this is one of the first runs in 1940, made 10,000 with no prefix. Look at that, blued barrel and no lanyard. And here's another one. This one is no prefix, no lanyard, blued barrel. So therefore, the author and many collectors have concluded, even though we can't prove it, we believe these 2 went to the Navy. They never were given the stick wing eagle, but we do believe they went to the Navy. They're both no prefix, and then there are some also in the A block. Then by the D block, they stopped making them with the slot. You also don't see any Navies after that point. Again, it was an early order of 1940. Not sure how many went to the Navy, but by the D block, they started doing away with that. There wasn't a hard stop, meaning I have seen them in the E block with the stock, and without. I've seen them in the D block with the stock lug and without. But after about, at the end of D, certainly beginning of E, you find Polish Radoms with no lug stock because they weren't using it. So again, they're just trying to cut down on the amount of time. They downgraded the finish, and they saved time on the lug stock because they weren't using it. And so during this period of time, during the Nazi era, I have pistols I can show you. They have, in the early, they go from A all the way through M. You can see what they look like. That general construction is deteriorating, meaning there's no more machining marks. They're not polishing them out. And then they go all the way to Z. Now, let's pause a minute because something happened at the end of the alphabet. So again, they skipped 6 letters, made about 200,000 from no prefix A to Z. But XYZ, they began to do away with one of the levers. Here's some late war. This one is really in bad shape. I have no idea if it left the factory like that or what happened. This one is in the E block, but it only has 2 levers. See, they eliminated this lever. This additional safety, they decided wasn't needed, so they eliminated it. And so that happened in the XYZ block. And so then we have a second run of A through K. So A through K, remember they made 200,000 A to Z, and then they made another 100,000 from A to K. And then the war ended in Poland because the Russians came in and took over in 1944. And by then, most of these were going to the Steyr factory anyway, but the last production was the K block. So this one is in the E block, second run. So as soon as I see this, I see it's late war, it's a very poor finish, very poor construction. I see the 2 levers, so I know this is a second run in the E block. So again, you're at a gun show, you're looking through and you find something that is F, and you say, oh, that must be early 1941, but it only has 2 levers. Oops, made a mistake, that's more like 1943 or 44. So the finishes I already mentioned, here we have a rust blue, went to a salt blue, and then in 1944, the very end, they went to a phosphated finish. These are both in the K block. Let's take a look. You see the K block, and now they're using a wooden grip. I'll say more about grips in just a second, but the K block were the last ones. In fact, this was one of the last ones made, 4900. Here's one that's even later, and it is K5500. This is probably one of the last ones made that were put together. This was made in the Steyr factory, or put together in the Steyr factory, and the Waffen proof, you probably can't even see it, but the Waffen proof would be 623. The magazines were actually made in a sub-factory right outside of the Steyr factory, and so the Waffen proof on that is 189, and again on the bottom and on the side. So Waffen 77 was Radom, but then a lot of times they took the parts and shipped them to the Steyr factory where they were stamped 623. If you find a Radom and you look at the proofs, you can pretty much tell the story of the gun. But let's pause for a minute and talk about why they moved from the Radom factory to the Steyr factory. So in researching this, and if you study the Polish Radoms very much, you can very quickly recognize that the Polish people were very proud and freedom-loving people. Because we know from the Warsaw Ghetto they had an uprising and many, many people were killed. Both Jews and non-Jews rose up to fight the Germans, and there's been a lot of TV series about the Warsaw Uprising. But the whole history of the factory, what's amazing is all the way back to 1940, they were recording a lot of pilfering of the factory. For one thing, the Polish workers were sabotaging the guns, and secondly, they were stealing the guns. There's a lot of pictures of Polish resistance fighters who are using Polish Radoms, and there's a whole section in this book about the number of guns that are found with no serial numbers or strange markings. And what they figured out is they're taking them out of the factory in a lunchbox. They're called lunchbox guns. Now, all the factories had some pilfering and some sabotage. However, throughout the Third Reich, the German records indicate that the Polish factory was the worst in terms of their production because things were being stolen and guns were being sabotaged. So that tells me, and by the way, if they were caught, they were taken out back and shot. So the Polish people were tough to stand up against building these guns for the Germans, and they regularly would use them for their own purposes. Now, so what they would do is they let the Radom factory build the parts. They would then send the parts to the Steyr Factory, which was in Austria, and they would put them together there, and that's why they had the second Steyr stamp. Also, and again, I did a whole video, if you look at the BNZ, in the K block, there were some that were marked BNC. Those are very, very rare. Here's a picture of one here, and I did a whole video on that gun. And I talked about the fact that they used slave labor. Within the Steyr factory, there were several concentration camps around the perimeter where they actually put these guns together, and they made the magazines. So there were sub camps around the Steyr factory, and many of these guns were made by slave labor. Unfortunately, that's just part of the history. You can watch that whole video, and I go into a lot more depth about that. One other thing I want to point out at this end of the table is the difference. You can see this was the Polish holster, very nicely made, and I'm sure expensive to make at the time, whereas the German holster, they just wanted very practical. Here's three holsters for the Polish Radom from the Nazi era. They did come in brown early on, so 40, 41, they would tend to be brown, and then later in the war they were black. Now they named it the P.35, so they had a lot of names, the VIS, the Radom. The Germans labeled it the P.35 because, as you know, they had different models. They had the P.38, they had the P.08, the P.37, which would have been the Femeru. So the P.35 is designated as the Polish Radom. You can barely see the BNZ, so this was made probably in a sub-camp near Steyr. And I don't see a date on this one, but the brown holster tells me it's a little bit early. This one has a date of 1944. It comes actually with this phosphated gun because here's a phosphate spare mag. It has an Eagle 189 proof on the side. You can't really see it, but that's where it is. And then here's one other one in better shape than most. Let's see what the markings on here. Black Radom holster. You can see the P.35, and I don't see a date. But these holsters would go with these guns, and you can kind of see the fit. So that's how they came as a rig, with the holster, the gun, and then a spare magazine. So that's the overview of the production of the Polish Radom. If you're a collector of German pistols, you probably want to run out and get one right away. The reason I don't have very many in the letter block is every time we get them, they're sold. These were from my personal collection. I tend to collect the very early and the very late. The same is true with P.38s. I collect the really early ones, and then I collect the late ones. All the ones in the middle are the most common. So you have to check our site regularly to ever find one, and they don't last very long. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something today. And make sure you like and subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, because I'm going to be doing some new videos real soon.